Okay, so get this. What if something we all thought was fine, like totally okay back in the day, actually messed with millions of people's minds?
Kind of freaky,
Yeah.
right? And the research we're looking at today, suggests it might be more than just an idea.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about this new study on the long-term effects of childhood lead exposure on mental health here in the US. And we'll be looking at the study itself. It was just published this month. And we've also got excerpts from a Reddit discussion, like a whole thread about it.
The interesting thing is this isn't some obscure academic debate. This could change how we think about mental health for all of society.
For sure. And honestly, you probably or someone you know lived through this time with so much lead exposure. So let's start by breaking down the study. It was published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and it looks at the impact of leaded gas use specifically from 1940 to 2015.
And one of the first things that jumps out is how many people were exposed. The study thinks that over half of the US population during those years was exposed to adverse levels of lead as kids. It's not just a few cases here and there. We're talking about a huge chunk of the population.
That's a lot of people. It makes you wonder what kind of impact did that have?
Well, the study estimates a crazy 151 million extra mental disorders in the U.S. because of lead exposure. It's like taking everyone in California and Texas saying they all have a mental disorder because of lead.
I never thought of it that way. That's a lot. And I'm guessing this wasn't like the same for every generation.
Yeah, you're right. It seems like Generation X, those born between 66 and 86, got hit the hardest.
Mm.
They were growing up when we used the most leaded gas.
Right.
So their exposure was way higher.
Okay, so a lot of people affected, especially Gen Xers. But what does lead actually do that causes all these problems?
That's where it gets really interesting. The study says lead doesn't cause specific mental illnesses, but it does something worse. It makes you vulnerable to a bunch of different problems.
So it's not like lead just flicks a switch and you have depression, but it's more like it weakens your defenses. So you're more susceptible to those issues.
Think of it like this lead messes up the balance of neurotransmitters in your brain, especially dopamine, which is important for motivation focus, impulse control. So it's not just feeling more anxious or depressed. Your brain's ability to regulate those feelings is messed up.
Wow. So it's messing with how our brains work. Did the researchers look at any specific mental health challenges?
They did. They found people exposed to more lead as kids were more likely to have what are called internalizing symptoms, things like anxiety and depression, and not just mood disorders. They also found more ADHD symptoms.
So it's affecting how people think and act, not just how they feel. What else?
The study also found some stuff about personality. People with more lead exposure had higher neuroticism, meaning they're more prone to anxiety, worry, negative emotions, but they had lower conscientiousness, which is linked to self-discipline, being organized responsibility.
So basically, lead might make you stress out more and be less likely to keep your cool. And this is all from something that was in our gas for years. It's crazy.
It is. It just goes to show how connected our environment and our health are. And this isn't just history. We're still seeing the effects today.
Which brings us to that Reddit discussion. This study got people talking, and there's some really interesting stuff there. What stood out to you?
Well, for one thing, it's clear this isn't just a problem of the past. People were saying leaded aviation fuel is still being used. So people living near airports are still being exposed.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that. It's like we haven't learned, we're still finding these hidden sources of lead, just like how we're just realizing how bad microplastics are.
Exactly. And that started a debate about whether lead was a factor in the global crime wave in the 80s.
Wait, are you saying that lead exposure could have caused more crime?
It's complicated. Of course, we can't say for sure. But think about it. Crime rates peaked globally in the 80s, about 20 years after the most lead use. And we know lead impacts impulsivity, aggression, emotional regulation, all things connected to crime.
The timing is interesting, but correlation isn't causation, right? Maybe the 80s crime wave was because of other stuff like social or economic problems?
Of course, there are always lots of factors. And we had to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
But this brings up some questions about the effects of lead on society as a whole.
Yeah, a lot to think about. So lead might be affecting our brains, our personalities, even social trends. What else was the Reddit crowd talking about?
There was a discussion about how this could affect generations. Some people wondered if kids raised by parents exposed to lead might also be affected, even if they weren't exposed themselves.
Wait, so you're saying even if I wasn't exposed, my parents could have been, and it still affects me?
It's a good question. Think about it. If your parent has mental health problems from lead exposure, that's going to affect how you grow up your environment, how you deal with stress. It's like a ripple effect that goes beyond just one person. It's pretty wild, right? Like We think of mental health as this like personal thing, but this study shows it's bigger than that. It's like something like lead from years ago is still affecting our mental health today.
Like some kind of collective trauma we're just figuring out. And how does knowing this change how we deal with mental health now?
That's the thing, right? It makes us look past the simple explanations. For so long, it's been all about personal choices, genetics, family stuff, but this adds like a whole new level.
Like we've been missing pieces of the puzzle this whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And knowing about lead could change how we prevent and treat these problems. Like, what if doctors checked kids for lead? Or we had special therapies just for people affected by it?
I hadn't thought about the treatment side. Are there ways to fix the damage? Lead does it?
We definitely need more research. But there are some promising things. For example, some studies show that certain nutrients can help, like omega-3 fatty acids and zinc. Early intervention programs could also be really important, especially ones focused on cognitive and emotional stuff.
That's good to hear. So it's not just about finding the problem, it's about finding solutions.
Right. And this could also change how we talk about mental health stigma. If we know lead makes you more vulnerable to mental illness, it's harder to blame people for their struggles.
Yeah, it's not their fault. It's because of this thing in the environment. Makes me think about how we used to think about smoking. People blame smokers for lung cancer until we learned about nicotine and how the tobacco companies tricked people.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah.
And just like with smoking, we need to stop blaming people and focus on finding solutions together.
This is heavy stuff, but really important. And speaking of important, there were some other things from that Reddit discussion.
Oh, yeah. Those online discussions can be kind of crazy, but
Yeah.
this one had some really smart people. Where do you want to start?
Well, that thing about leaded aviation fuel, it's easy to think lead is a problem of the past, but obviously it's not.
Right. And it makes you wonder what other hidden sources of lead there are. We focus on the big stuff, but sometimes the little things are what really hurt us.
Like microplastics. We're just starting to figure out how dangerous they are. It's scary to think what we might find out later.
Totally. And it shows we need to be more proactive about environmental health.
Mm-hmm.
Can't wait for something to become a huge problem before we do something.
And what about that discussion about lead and the crime wave in the 80s? You think there's really a connection?
I think it's worth looking into more. Like we said, lead affects the parts of the brain that control impulses, emotions, decisions. And the timing is interesting. Crime peaked about 20 years after we used the most lead.
Like a delayed reaction, but for all of society.
Exactly. And it shows that the effects of these toxins can be really big. We need to think about how they affect not just individuals, but also society and culture.
Someone on Reddit mentioned lead poisoning and the Roman Empire. Like, lead could have been part of why that huge civilization collapsed. It's kind of scary.
It shows that even the most powerful societies can be hurt by environmental problems. And the choices we make today can affect people for generations.
It makes you wonder what the lead problems of today are. What things around us might be hurting us without us even knowing.
That's the question, isn't it? We need to be careful for question what we think we know and be proactive.
And it's not just about the government and scientists. We all have to do something, right?
For sure. Even small things can make a difference. Like we can choose to buy products from companies that care about the environment, being honest.
So like voting with our money, choosing products that don't have harmful stuff.
Exactly. And we can push for stronger rules, support groups that protect the environment and our health, and learn more about these things. The more we know and do, the more we can make people in charge make real changes.
This has been really interesting. I feel like I get the lead problem better, but also the bigger picture, how connected our environment and our health are.
It shows that we're not just separate people living alone. We're all part of a system. And what we do affects everyone.
So what's the one thing you want people to remember from all this?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't just assume things are true, and demand better for yourself and for future generations. The lead story is a warning, but it also shows that we can change things. We can learn from the past and make a healthier future.
That's a great point. Thanks for being here. It's been really eye-opening.
It's been fun. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world.
So with all this lead stuff, what's like the big question? Should we all be freaking out or what?
I think the big thing is we got to stop just reacting to environmental problems and be more proactive. Like instead of waiting for something bad to happen, we need to be looking ahead and stopping problems before they get huge.
It's like we've been playing catch-up way too long, right? We wait for things to get messed up and then try to fix it. Yeah. What would being proactive even look like?
Well, we need more research, for one thing. We got to be looking for those early signs that something's wrong. Like, think of it as preventative care for the whole planet.
So, like, instead of waiting for the canary to die in the mine, we're, like, checking its heart rate and making sure it can breathe.
Exactly. We need to be watching the air, the water, the soil, all that stuff that can affect people. And we need to look at the long-term effects of the stuff we use, not just what happens right away.
Okay, that makes sense. But research is only part of it, right?
Yeah.
What about actually doing something? How do we use all that knowledge to change things?
Well, a lot of it is about laws and rules. We need stricter rules about the chemicals and stuff we allow. And we need to get rid of the dangerous ones, like they did with lead, eventually. It took a long time, but it shows it's possible.
Yeah, it shows that these things take time. But what about us regular people? What can we do? It feels kind of overwhelming, like it's out of our control.
I know what you mean. It's easy to feel helpless when it comes to these big problems. But we can do things, even small things that can add up. Like we can be smart about what we buy and support companies that care about the environment and are honest.
So, like choosing to spend our money on products that are less likely to have bad stuff in them.
Yeah. And we can push for stricter rules, support groups that are trying to protect the environment and learn more about these problems. The more we know and do, the more we can force the people in charge to actually make changes.
This has been really interesting. I feel like I get the lead problem a lot better now,
Yeah.
but also just how connected everything is, like our environment and our health.
Yeah, it shows that we're not just individuals, we're all connected. And what we do affects everyone else.
So to wrap up, what's the one thing you want everyone listening to take away from this?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't just believe everything you hear. And demand better for yourself and for future generations. The lead thing is a warning, but it also shows that we can change things. We can learn from what happened and make a better future.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. Anytime. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and let's make the world a better place.